right? The establishment's taken the blue pill and they're living in la la land, while an entire generation of lost boys was completely abandoned. And so then you get you get these online losers like the Bronze Age pervert who entirely exploits this lost generation. I mean, he's smart enough to realize that the real enemy on the left is nihilism and egalitarianism, right?
Yeah.
And that's where Establishment Inc. should have been directing its time and attention. It should have been defending the lost boys.
Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you. Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 308. I'm talking to C. Bradley Thompson. He is a professor at Clemson University. He's written a few books, and he's also with the Snow Institute for the Study of Capitalism. Clemson seems to be more of a conservative place than other campuses out there, and he's been there for a while. He's been there for quite a while. So, how are you, Brad?
I'm doing just fine, Chris. How are you?
Yeah, and you've also been published in the Objective Standards and some other things. How did you get into Ayn Rand?
It happened right at the very end of high school, and a good friend of mine read The Fountainhead, and I saw it transform his life. So I read it, and it changed my life, and the rest is history.
Yeah, and that must have been a while back then.
Yeah, that far too long for me to remember, actually.
Yeah, this has become another standard question for me, but if you don't want to answer, that's fine. But I've been asking a lot of, especially older professors, when were you in college and what did you pay for it at the time?
So I was in college 1978 to 1982. Mm-hmm. And, to be perfectly honest, how much did it cost? I started at Queen's University in Canada, and the tuition there, which is subsidized by the federal government, tuition was, I don't know, it was $800. I don't remember if that was a semester or for the whole year. And then I transferred and graduated from a small college in Colorado called Western State College. But I went there on a track and field scholarship. So I didn't pay any tuition. But my recollection is that tuition was, I don't know, $1,500 a semester for, maybe at most $5 total. But I don't really remember.
Okay, then let's get on to top. What I found interesting, you wrote this article about right-wing Gramscianism versus classical liberalism, and you made some good points here, because I do wonder if our libertarian or objectivist movements just aren't really offering much to the youth right now. Can you elaborate on what you said in this article on your Substack, which is Redneck Intellectual?
Yeah, it's the redneckintellectual.com. And so there was an article in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago on what it called the Gramscian right in MAGA, or something to that effect. It was an essay featuring Chris Rufo. And Chris Rufo is a very well-known right-wing journalist who has spent the last 4 or 5 years exposing and skewering, DEI, critical race theory, critical gender theory, critical whateverism theory. And I mean, he's really just sort of been a one-man wrecking crew. And I mean that in a very positive sense. And it turns out Rufo, who actually was a man of the left, I believe, in his youth, has been influenced by the early 20th century Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. And Gramsci is most famous for having written a book called Prison Notebooks, which he wrote when he was imprisoned by Mussolini from 1929 to 1936, 37, I believe. And
37. Yeah, he died in 37.
Yeah. And what Gramsci did was to sort of flip Marx on his head. So traditional old left Marxism believed that history was not what you study in the past, but history moves forward, and that the dialectical materialism and scientific socialism predicted that there would eventually be a proletarian or a working class revolution based on the economic oppression of the working class. Well, that never turned out. And many Marxist intellectuals in the 20s realized that the working class, the proletariat, were in fact the most conservative force in society, and that there would never be a proletarian revolution. And so therefore what Gramsci did in his book, The Prison Notebooks, is sort of flip Marx right side up. And Gramsci argued that the great force in society is what he called cultural hegemony. It's the idea that the bourgeoisie, the oppressor class, they force their opinions on the lower class. And so therefore, to inspire ultimately a working class revolution, what you have to do is you have to change the culture. And the way in which you change the culture is you have to change the culture forming institutions, that is the opinion forming institutions. So even though he didn't use the phrase the long march through the institutions, this is an idea that was developed much later in the 1960s by Rudi Deuschke, a German Marxist. Gramsci argued that you have to sort of capture the opinion forming institutions, which means first and foremost the universities. And that basically has been the blueprint of the left over the course of almost a century now. And so what Rufo has done is he says we need to take a page out of Gramsci's book, and we need to retake the culture forming, opinion forming institutions. And the way in which you do that is since the left has total cultural hegemony of those institutions, you basically have to play hardball, right? And so this kind of new right, dissident right, of which Rufo is a part, they're no longer playing by the same rules that traditional conservatives, libertarians, classical liberals, and objectivists played by. They're playing what I call fight club politics, or smash mouth politics. And it's go after the left hard and beat them until you beat them into submission. And you don't stop. And you also have to be willing, when necessary, to possibly even use the coercive force of the state to put them down. In other words, use the same tactics that the left did to gain cultural hegemony. And so he's suggesting that the right should use the same tactics as the left. All right, I've just laid out a lot, so let me pause and see if you have anything you want to dig down on.
Well, first, just for anybody listening, I want to spell Gramsci. That's Gramsci if they want to look at. And Rufo is just RUFO for people who may not know, but people here probably do know who Rufo is. One thing I am curious about, did Gramsci have any interaction with the Frankfurt School, which was in Germany at the same time?
Yeah. That's a really interesting question. I am not a historian of 20th century intellectual history or of the left. So I don't know with certainty, but my guess is, the most he would have had probably with them is correspondence. he had a lot of time on his hands when he was in jail, but he was not formally a part of the Frankfurt School.
Okay, yeah, that is something I have, as you pointed out, though, the long march through the institutions, and really, it's Brad, what Ayn Rand said, we have to go out and take over the colleges and all this stuff, and I think we can safely say that's been a complete failure. I mean, we've got good people like you out there, but really the colleges have gotten a lot worse too. It's, even though people were calling it out 35 years ago,
the colleges have gotten considerably worse, and I think this is partly attributable to the fact that in 1989, 1990, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Soviet Union, then the fall of the Eastern Bloc, I think what happened is that what I call conservatism and libertarianism Inc., they went to sleep, and they assumed that Marxism was dead, and therefore they didn't have to fight it anymore, that the Cold War was over. What they didn't understand, of course, is that the left just went underground for 10 or 15 years, and it reinvented itself. It reinvented itself in many new ways. It rebirthed itself, through political correctness and wokeism, and then it started taking on all of these other kinds of issues. So it used women's studies, Black studies, Chicano studies. And certainly the LGBTQ movement, it infiltrated all of these movements, and then from there it went. They instead of being engaged in street battles, they took over the Boy Scouts. Right? They took over, just as one example. They took over the Boy Scouts. That ideology sort of took over all of these cultural institutions, and very, very slowly, and maybe most importantly, what they took over. I mean, they sort of, even though they went underground on college campuses, they reinvented themselves on college campuses, and they just did this very, very slow, quiet, silent march through the universities, and conservatives either weren't interested, didn't see, weren't looking, and then the left sort of came back about 2010, and that's, I think, when we can sort of date the beginning of the rise of the new left. And of course, they've been running rampant through our college campuses, and they've been using all of these other issues to advance cultural issues, to advance their agenda.
Well, if I could point to one particular event, I believe the Duke lacrosse fiasco was in 2006 or 2007, because they've been pushing what they've been pushing what I just call victim culture. The culture of everybody's a victim, glorifying the victims, and at the same time, pushing this narrative that all men are rapists, that kind of crap, and I've seen that hit people. The all men are rapists things, and just false accusations against men is the thing that's really hit hard, at least what I've seen personally, and people I know.
I agree. I would say the Duke lacrosse case is a very good example of this. I mean, that whole issue got taken over by the hard left, and then around 2010, you started seeing the rebirth of demonstrations on college campuses, and there was one in particular in 2010 that got a lot of play, and there was this crazy professor who was filmed and then put up on YouTube, attacking students, verbally attacking and abusing students. And there were other instances like that where you saw like literally the emergence of a new left, and this new left also had the quality and characteristic of I mean, they had certain pathologies, psychological pathologies, which can only simply be described as insanity, right? There was, like, if you watch a lot of the videos from back in that period, and these demonstrators, there was also a famous demonstration at Yale where a well-known Yale professor got surrounded by a group of 20 students and berated and harassed. And what seems so different between what was happening in the early 2000 and 2000 is that these people were just unhinged. They had no arguments at all. They were just emoting a kind of psychology. And that's what we've lived with over the course, I think, of the last 15 years, is an emotive left.
Yeah, it also seems like it, maybe to their credit, they also went out and utilized all the new media, YouTube, short videos on YouTube, Facebook. And this seems to be, I've noticed now that this seems to be what happens in history is the people who utilize the new media end up beating the people who are using the old media.
That's right.
Yeah, just the same way that FDR used the radio while all the newspapers were attacking him, but he won because he was on the radio. It's
I think that's absolutely right. Right, you see the beginning, right, of Facebook and what was then Twitter. And Insta messaging, right? You could create an Insta mob, in a heartbeat, using the new media, and I definitely think you can trace the beginning of all of that to, again, around 2010.
Certainly, and the other thing too is, I had a guy on a while back just talking about Washington, D.C. passing a bill to require restaurant workers to be paid the minimum wage, the same minimum wage as everybody else. The restaurant owners were opposed to it, but also all of the people in the wait staff were opposed to it. This was pushed by a bunch of do-gooders. And it shows what I call what's often called the victim triangle: the victim, the perpetrator, and the rescuer. And you have this class of people, especially in academia, they want to be the rescuers, whether the supposed victim wants to be rescued or not.
Yeah, no, I agree. Liberal, what I call liberal socialism is today in 2025 less an ideology than it is a psychology.
It's definitely a psychology, and it's often not good to say that your people are mentally ill, but it seems like almost all of them are. And they're getting into other things that are just so. I didn't want to, it's hard, but this article too that said, as you pointed out, that we're really not addressing that we really aren't addressing this and offering much to young people. It's I think. I think a lot of Americans also hope that maybe with the election of Obama that we could actually move beyond race, and things ended up getting worse after that. Even though the election of a African American president should say we're not a racist country, but
just obviously just the opposite happened. But the fact of the matter is, the left knew that, and they were just lying when they said, right, that we can by electing Barack Obama, America can finally move on from the race issue. No, they didn't mean that. That was never true. What they meant was, now we get to triple down on the subject. Which of course they have. And right now, I mean, governments, state governments and local governments are seriously taking up the issue of reparations in, not surprisingly, Massachusetts, California, Illinois. So I mean, and this is kind of Rufo's point. Rufo's point is that the left never sleeps. Never.
Yeah, they do.
Right. And, one of the interesting things that we have learned in the last 100+ days with Doge is that hundreds of millions, and maybe now over the course of a couple of decades, billions of dollars were being diverted to left-wing organizations, NGOs, in the United States via this organization USAID, the purpose of which was to fund organizations overseas, right? So,
Yes.
right. So organizations, Soros-related organizations, for instance, were getting huge amounts of money, and then diverting it to left-wing organizations in the United States. So when conservatives, libertarians, classical liberals, and objectivists wonder how it is, why it is, right, that the left it has such cultural hegemony, so much force, they never stop. It's 24/7 in your face all the time. It is at least in part because they have access literally to hundreds, if not billions of dollars, which they are directing towards both educational and cultural issues. And it's pretty tough. It's pretty hard to compete against that.
Soros, but who I think is probably becoming more dangerous than Soros right now is two divorcees and one widow. The divorcees are Gates and Bezos, and the widow is Jobs.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, they have control of tens of billions of dollars. Yeah. And they are much more political and ideological than their former husbands. And they're using their money for cultural change. I mean, much less. And see, this is the thing. This is the extraordinary thing, is that the left has always. I mean, they invest a lot of money in politics, to be sure, but they understand that politics is downstream from culture, and culture is downstream from the universities. And what's interesting is that, again, conservatives, libertarians, classical liberals, objectivists, they understand, to quote Richard Weaver, that ideas have consequences. And they've always understood that. And certainly objectivists, probably more than any other ideological group in that larger sort of umbrella, have understood this. But they don't have the resources. They don't have the billions of dollars to be giving away. And certainly amongst conservatives and libertarians, and I see this with some regularity, they think everything begins and ends with politics, right? So they're much more like wealthy donors, wealthy conservative and libertarian donors are much more likely to give their money to, the only choice would be Republican politicians. And, how'd that work out for you?
Yeah.
And the answer obviously is not very well.
When what was it? David Koch who died a few years ago, or was it Charles? But when one of those died a few years ago, I thought to myself, what would have happened if 40 years ago, instead of funding all these think tanks, they would have started a movie studio, a TV studio, a record company, a book publisher instead? What would have happened if they'd done that instead of spending money on all these think tanks?
Or even better yet, what if they had started founding new colleges and universities? I mean, we've had to wait almost 75 years for the creation of new colleges and universities, and just in the last 5+ years, right, we're now starting to see the creation new colleges and academic programs, and that's good. And it's the beginning of something, to be sure. But my fear is that it's too little, too late.
Well, I think the college bubble might be starting to burst anyway, just because it's losing so much prestige. But Brad, I've asked other people too this, and as I've been involved. I first got into Ayn Rand in 1992. I've been around the liberty movement and objectivist movements, for all that time. What happened to our movements in 2020?
In 2020,
there was almost complete silence from very. I mean, there were a few people who were speaking up, but they were far, and there weren't enough of them. Jeff Tucker, to his credit, was the loudest person speaking out against this nonsense. But
yeah, no, he was, and I haven't followed the objectivist movement in recent years as closely as I might have to know what they were or were not doing during that period. But what you say sort of tracks, I think, with my sense of the matter. And what we need, one Chris Rufo is not enough, right? You need 25, 50 Chris Rufos, and in various different areas. Now, I will say though, and this is one of the things that I try to bring out in my essay. As much as I admire Rufo's relentless, unceasing attack on the left, his exposure of the complete and utter corruption, for instance, of the education establishment. What I worry though about is that Mr. Rufo, it's his ends, right? His means are clear to see. But it's not at all clear to me what ends he is pursuing, right? And this is my concern, and this is why I wrote the piece, and this is really sort of at the heart of the piece, is because a number of young men, starting in the 2000 aughts, they were in effect abandoned by what I call conservatism, libertarianism, Inc. A lot of the young men on what has become the reactionary right came out of the DC think tanks. And I know this for a fact because I know a lot of these young men. I've come to know them in part because I wrote a series of essays in 2020, 2021 attacking them. And so I spent about 2 years at the receiving end of their counterattacks. But I've also gotten to know a lot of them and had conversations with a lot of them. And all of them, say the same thing, which is that conservatism, libertarianism, Inc., and possibly beyond those two particular philosophic movements, they were effectively abandoned by those organizations, right? I mean, when you are told every single day of your life, from the day you enter kindergarten until the day you graduate from college, that you're racist, sexist, and homophobic by virtue of being white, male, and heterosexual, and you become even though you are the victim, you are constantly told you are the oppressor. And during that period from, let's say, 2010 to the present day, those young men, boys originally, and then young men, had no defenders. And what was happening is that the establishment was just writing endless white papers on free market transportation policy or legalizing pot, without realizing that the left had shifted its attack. The left was at Thermopylae, with 300,000 troops, and there were just a few people at Thermopylae on the other side defending the canyon. But instead, Conservatism Libertarianism Inc. sent all of its resources to North Africa, to continue the analogy. And so those young men felt as though they had been completely abandoned by the establishment. And therefore they eventually migrated over to the kooky right. In fact, I don't even consider them to be right at all.
But I can understand that, because I very rarely hear, in fact, some of these, I think, to a certain extent, in some respects, they've encouraged victim culture. I mean, when I suspect a lot of these men probably got falsely accused by a woman at one point, and they saw nobody defending them, and that's an experience that really hits you in the heart and soul. You're not the same after that. It's not really like you're taking the red pill. You're just having it shoved down your throat.
No, that's right. And the establishment has taken the blue pill, right? The establishment's taken the blue pill, and they're living in la la land, while an entire generation of lost boys was completely abandoned. And so then you get you get these online losers like the Bronze Age pervert, who entirely exploits this lost generation. I mean, he's smart enough to realize that the real enemy on the left is nihilism and egalitarianism, right?
Yeah.
And that's where Establishment Inc. should have been directing its time and attention. It should have been defending the lost boys, but instead it wasn't. It was instead giving us another white paper on energy policy.
Yeah,
all of which is fine, but I'm sorry, that's not where the action is, right?
Yeah.
You know where the action is, where your enemy is.
Yes. It reminds me of what, when in 2020, when I went out to see Joe Jorgensen and Spike Cohen speak, and Dave Smith made the comment about one of Joe's speeches that said, if you'd shown up in a time machine at that speech, you wouldn't have known if it was 1996 or 2020. And I said, yeah, you wouldn't have, because there was almost no talk about coronavirus. And I mean, I think we could have reached out and said, yes, your problems got canceled. But part of the problem too with I think the COVID narrative is a direct result. At least I don't think you can talk about the whole COVID narrative without talking about what I call the pussification of this society. And, and not to mention though, but Trump promoted the coronavirus because he wanted to demonize China. So the conservatives were already blocked on that, because they had initially promoted the coronavirus, and then the left took it up as their cause because it bought into their nihilism of just destruction for the sake of destruction. I mean, I've become, coronavirus made me much more of a libertarian separatist, and not just because a libertarian society will flourish, but because a non-libertarian society is going to go the way of Jonestown.
Well, I mean, I can certainly understand why.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go back and you think about those dark days, beginning in March of 2020, and really for the next entire year, this country was in a pathological state. I mean, it was pure insanity. What was happening? I mean, I mean, it was the most utterly bizarre period of my entire life. And fortunately for me, I was able to, I mean, in a sense, I was able to skate through that period just because of the nature of my job. And I work at home a lot, and I spent a lot of my time writing. And so during that period, my life actually wasn't interrupted very much at all. I still spent 8 hours at home writing, and then would go into the office. But of course, the office was always half empty because university rules mandated you could not have more than 50% of the people in the office. Was, for me, that was the worst of it. Well, the worst of it actually were the masks by far. Our university had a mask mandate policy, which I refused to follow. And because I was going to die of a brain aneurysm or a stroke before I was going to die of COVID. Die of a brain aneurysm or a stroke by virtue of wearing the mask and lecturing, for 75 minutes. That's insane. That's totally insane.
Yeah. It was all insane, and I don't know if you consider these people part of the kooky right, but the one network in my life that was always saying this is nuts were people like Rollo Tomasi and somebody like Andrew Tate. They said this is nuts. And we haven't commented on Tate, who has got a lot more bigger following than Bronze Age pervert.
Yeah, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, Chris. I've seen this guy Tate a little bit on X. I hear about him every now and then, but I really haven't followed him at all. So I don't know really much about the guy. But this much I can tell you: whatever it is I've seen on X, I've not liked at all.
I can understand that. It's just, it seems like he's filling a void though that conservatives haven't even touched.
Well, yes, that part I think is probably true.
He doesn't apologize for being who he is. He's very good at telling stories, and I think telling good stories is always helpful. And there's just this. I don't agree. I would prefer other models than that too. Sometimes I think Nick Freitas, for example, is a very positive model of masculinity. He's got a podcast and he was in the Virginia State Legislature for a while, but some of these people, they're just, you even look, for example, at Jordan Peterson, who I think does a lot of good work and asks a lot of questions, but it's like, I say, how many times is your daughter going to be married, Jordan? She's already on number 2. It's.
Well, I don't have anything. I'm not sure to what you were referring, but what I would say,
Michaela has already gotten married, had a baby, and divorced, and then married a second husband. So I said, how many is it going to be? That's his daughter. It's like, you have these people who say, we got to, are preaching at men, you should man up and marry these women. But, these women are taking them to divorce and trying to transition their kids and other stuff,
Well, let me say this much about Peterson. Yeah. So I followed his rise and fall pretty closely. So beginning, 2016, 17, I started following him before he had become a thing. We actually had him come to Clemson to give a talk. And, I was struck by how quickly his star rose and more specifically what his message was and to whom he was appealing, right? And he was appealing mostly young men in the 18 to 35-year-old category. And, his star just rose to mix the metaphor, like a rocket. And the question is why? And I think the biggest part of the answer to that question is that he saw that there was an enormous cultural deficit that was being experienced, particularly by young men, that was not being addressed by the establishment right. And it was pretty simple stuff, right? It was about the nature of, if you had to sum up what Peterson was all about during that time, you would say it's about the nature of meaning. And if you're dealing with an entire generation of young men who have no meaning in their lives indeed have become meaningless. And along comes Peterson and starts to give them the tools by which to sort of re-own, to take back control of their own lives by things as simple and as silly as make your bed, right? But the fact that this is one of the rules of his book, right, tells you how bad things have become, right? Where if an entire generation of young men is hearing the message, make your bed, and it's making them have an existential crisis, then that's an indication of how bad things really are, right? And that's what Peterson did, which the establishment was unable to do. What Peterson did was to find the problem and to speak to a generation of young people where they are, not where you necessarily want them to be, but you start with where they are, right? And where they are is in a state of existential meaninglessness.
Oh, yes.
Right. And despair.
I think, I do think a lot of people find some form of, you find a career that has purpose and where you're doing something that really you think is important and makes a difference. But for a lot of people, the only thing that gives them meaning is having kids. And ultimately, for most of us on this planet, nobody's really going to care that we were alive other than our kids. You have your books, of course, but a lot of us, that's the only thing people really leave behind is they leave their kids behind and they have grandchildren, and that's their stamp on the world.
Yeah. Which is, look, this is one of the reasons why, now that the whole BAP thing is starting to fade, and the whole sort of masculinity movement may be starting to fade, which, by the way, let me just say, the fact that there is a masculinity movement, right, tells you something. It tells you something about the nature of the culture. And again, the complete and utter absence of the conservative libertarian movement to understand the meaning of that has been part of the problem. But what I would say is that going forward, we have to in a sense be ahead of the curve, not behind the curve.
Yeah.
The left is always ahead of the curve. They're always driving conservatives and libertarians and classical liberals and objectivists. They're always playing catch up, always playing catch up. Right. And that's the thing about Peterson, was that he was one of the first people to completely shift, to be out ahead of the curve and to completely shift the terms of debate. And he captured a generation. Now, the loss, his decline and then fall, very interestingly, came at the very moment that you get the rise in 2018 of the Bronze Age pervert, and but that whole thing is dying now, and we have to find new ways. I mean, I don't share the same moral political philosophy as Peterson, and I certainly don't of what I call the reactionary right. Look, the bottom line is I want to live in a free society, and I've dedicated my entire life to trying to promote the ideals of a free society. But we need more people doing that, and we need to do a better job of appealing to young people. And I mean, I've created a program at Clemson called the Lyceum Scholars Program, which is, I think, a kind of model for how to do that. We're still quite small, but we're growing, and Because like I'm not about fighting the left simply for the sake of fighting the left. I'm not fighting the left just because I hate them and I want to win, and then have ends that are anathema to a free society. No, I want to live in a free society. That's the end. That's the goal, and I spend a lot of my time thinking about how we can create the means to get to that end. And I think more generally speaking, people who are in the larger liberty movement need to do a much better job of that.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of problems in the liberty movement, but I don't think they know how to read the room, so to speak. I think that's why. But I don't think we're not. But it just seems like there isn't really. I think for a lot of men, they really maybe they want to fool around for a few years, but they really do want to get married and settle down. And we have a culture that has made that nearly impossible for them now.
No, that's right. And, one of the really interesting things that we're now seeing in the post-BAP, post-Tate, post-reactionary right world is the rise of traditional Catholicism. So there is a large movement of young people who are joining the Catholic converts to the Catholic Church, but not just to any Catholic church, right? They want to go to Latin Mass. So they're going to the most traditional parts of the Catholic Church. And a lot of young people are actually finding now that the Catholic Church is too liberal. And so there's been a huge movement in the last few years to the Orthodox Church.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know if you ever listened to Counterflow with Buck Johnson. He actually went from being a libertarian atheist, and now all he talks about now is orthodoxy. It's because they're the only ones who really take. I think, and also again, I can only imagine what kind of impact if the churches had said in 2020 said, "No, we are disobeying your orders. We are going to church." I think that would have been huge. But you look at the history of the church and see how many times they've rolled over and played dead for tyrants. Right. It's been most of the time. Sad but true. Of course, you're in one of the more, definitely still in one of the more Bible Belt states down there, South Carolina. But yeah, I definitely think there's and I don't know where that goes from here. I do have to ask you also, and I couldn't tell if you speak Spanish or not, but surely you have an opinion on the man in Argentina.
Well, I don't speak Spanish, but I do have what is probably only a superficial opinion of Milei. Yeah. And everything that I've seen, I've liked a lot. Now I don't follow him closely, so, I can't speak to everything that he's done. But, the thing about Milei, I guess I would say a couple of things about Milei. And I think the one video that came to North America of Milei, maybe the first one that really sort of rocketed him to kind of stardom in North America, was this interview that he did, I don't know, X number of years ago with a female journalist, probably in Argentina, where I mean, it's the most aggressive, principled attack on the left I've ever seen from a politician in my entire life. I mean, it was ruthless. He was utterly ruthless in his critique of the left. And where do we see that in North American conservative?
We don't. I mean, he asked, in the presidential debates, and you can watch any of these things and put subtitles on YouTube, but he asked Miriam Bregman, the communist, why do you support an ideology that killed 150 million people? And she had no answer. But I also think the fact that he was the lead singer of a Rolling Stone cover band and as a soccer player, I mean, that guy, this is a guy who knows how to go out there and be cool. And not be we've an economist who knows how to talk to regular people, which is not that easy to find.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in addition to the video where he's ripping post-it notes off a whiteboard and saying, is it a fuerte,
out.
All the government departments that he would abolish. I would say the third most important video of Milei was it was aboard a school bus. Somewhere in Argentina, probably Buenos Aires, and it's a school bus with sort of 10 to 12-year-old boys. And, like 10, 12-year-old boys, they're sticking their heads out the window. And all of a sudden they see Milei's car pull up beside them. And these little boys are just yelling and screaming and then ultimately sobbing at this. And Milei gets out of his vehicle. And he goes over, like in the middle of traffic in downtown Buenos Aires. He gets out of his vehicle and he walks over to the bus, and he's high-fiving, all of these 10 to 12-year-old boys. And these boys are now sobbing, meeting their hero. And he has a way of touching common people and finding them where they're at. I mean, he's a phenomenon. That's the bottom line.
He's got about 70% approval with voters under 32. It's really, I have more confidence in them than I do in America anymore. And that's unfortunate, but maybe it's not. It was also, I don't know where, but there's another video of him out there too, where last October, their equivalent of Anthony Fauci died, and he gave a speech, and he called him hijo de puta, which means son of whore. There's that sense of knowing when to be not nice, and you can't be. Sometimes you just have to be that way.
Sometimes you have to go for the jugular, right? And instead, Republicans get Mike Pence, right? So take Mike Pence versus Milei. I mean, it's just too. It's like that Seinfeld episode, with George Costanza, two worlds colliding, right? And a lot of people are just done. I mean, just done with establishmentarian Republican politics, Republican politicians, and even they're just done, with the standard conservative libertarian think tanks, in Washington, D.C. We live in interesting times.
Well, you talked about some of those young men who, that you knew. What were some of their biggest complaints when they argued with you about these things? That they felt abandoned. What were their grievances?
Well, I mean, I've already sort of. I mean, you mean their grievances in addition to their grievances against me?
Yeah, what were their specific grievances? Like, I can't get married. I can't buy a home. I mean, there's lots of different things.
Yeah. I mean, it was what I first mentioned, which is, having been told every day of their lives that they're racist, sexist, and homophobic, right? That they are guilty of committing crimes against people they've never seen or met in their entire lives, that they are, in effect, the focus of evil in the modern world. And that the culture has been disintegrating so quickly that they're living in mom and dad's basement apartment because they can't get jobs. They can't have normal lives. They don't see themselves as having prospects for, getting married and having families and becoming little league, soccer coaches, so there's there's a sense of desperation. And desperation leads you oftentimes to unsavory things.
Yeah, I agree, though. I don't think as Rand pointed out, I don't think the right has ever had much of an ideology. I mean, they've just been reacting to whatever the left does. And Since the end of World War II, the only thing that conservatism has really cared about is just spending as much money on the military as possible.
Yeah, well, plus just going along with every liberal democratic social program. I mean, if I had to identify in one word, I mean, there are lots of problems that one can identify with the conservative libertarian establishment, but I would say the biggest one is guilt. If I had to sum up in one word, the problem of the right, it's guilt.
Unearned unearned guilt or undeserved guilt. Yes, it is a problem, and I don't know how that really is a problem sometimes, because I think when you've been gaslighted so much, and then you realize, oh, I'm not the problem. But it's funny too, just seeing Nancy Mace post these things about, oh, I was the first woman to go into the Citadel. It's like, oh, and now you're a conservative. That's okay. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I
try to spend less time now on worrying about what other people think and do. And, I'm getting to that point in my life where, it's time to put up or shut up. And so I'm trying to put up and be as productive as I possibly can.
Well, that's important. Yeah, it's important to be productive and do something that makes a difference. And you do end up, it's like I put out recently, I said, I'm not arguing with anybody on Twitter who has less than 200 followers. And over time, I'll probably increase that number, because why bother? Because I've said that to other people and they kind of shake their heads. Yeah, that's not a bad idea. I said, but obviously if you're somebody who has 10 million Twitter followers, you probably got to have a higher number. But I don't know. Yeah, I do think there's a lot of people who are just sick and tired of losing, because they realize that conservatism never preserved anything. But I really do. I think a lot of these people like Rufo and they don't want, they don't want to abolish the master slave dichotomy. They just want to reverse it, and that's the problem here.
No, it's more of a revenge movement. At best, it's about revenge, and I can understand revenge as a motivation. Yeah. But when revenge becomes simply the means, or when it goes from being the means to the end, then you're now willing to take on a new kind of politics, and a kind of politics which goes against the kind of politics that I stand for and support. In other words, they're willing to give up the principles and institutions of a free society in order to gain. I mean, what they really want is they want to gain or access the coercive power of the state in order to wreak revenge on their enemies.
And and it just becomes gang warfare with no rules. I know you don't have that much time left, but I just thought of this. I should have asked you sooner. What do you think about Curtis Yarvin?
It's funny you should ask that question. I just received a request from New Yorker magazine a week or two ago, wanting to interview me on Curtis Yarvin, and I declined the interview for a number of reasons. The most important of which is I haven't followed Yarvin at all. I read a couple of essays he wrote on the American Revolution that he wrote them 15 plus years ago, and I wasn't particularly impressed by them. And I've seen him around a little bit, but I don't have an opinion on
okay. Yeah. Well, that I can't think of anybody else out there that's really that much worth mentioning. And you said you had about an hour. Well, where can we find you out there?
Yeah. On the net? So I'm on X. I don't remember my X handle, but just search C. Bradley Thompson. But maybe more importantly, people can find me at my Substack, which is The Redneck Intellectual. And the URL is all one word, theredneckintellectual.com.
Okay, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, go buy my novel, Escape from the Village. Check out my Substack. People are giving me money at buymeacoffee.com. Thank you, Brad Thompson. I'm Chris Baker. We're out. Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you.